as I start, do you guys normally have PowerPoint presentation, or is it just talking? Do you have a preference?
Normally we have these Word document presentations, but if you have a PowerPoint, that would be lovely. I think you should be able to share
screen. Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. So I'm just trying to find, oh yeah, share screen. Okay, cool. So that's good. I'm going to try and do a little bit of both and keep it within the time. So first of all, hello everybody. Ta-da! We're in the wacky world of online talking to each other through tiny little screen boxes, which sometimes works out surprisingly well. It's nice that we get to have lots of conversations this way that maybe would be harder otherwise. So I'm going to talk to you in a slightly general but also specific way about one of my favorite topics, which is being. And I'm going to do it in a way that is one of my favorite ways. That is to combine elements of the discussion of thinking about being in the Western tradition with elements of thinking about being in the Indian tradition. I'm going to pick up some of my favorite bits and try to just show how they speak to the same issues and offer some interesting kind of ways of thinking about this issue. All right, so hopefully there'll be a little bit of interest for people interested in Heidegger. I don't know what your backgrounds are. If I'm talking to hardcore analytic philosophers, if I'm talking to people who are studying Indian thought, if I'm talking to crazy committed phenomenologists, diehard Heideggerians, I have no idea. So I'm just gonna, forgive me if I'm telling you either things you know already or things that make no sense to you. But what I'm going to do is try and kind of speak a little bit across these different directions. So there'll be hopefully something for people interested in Heidegger and his project of trying to understand being. Hopefully also something for people interested in what I think the Indian tradition is doing when it tries to explore the notion of being with a capital B. And keeping in mind as a sort of background theme, the idea of being, of existence per se, of the sum total of all existence in its own distinctive character, is a question that I think is both really widespread and fundamental. You find it popping up autonomously in both Greek culture and in Indian culture. I'd love to have a whole separate conversation about whether thinking about existence per se is something very, very primal in a sense that humans come to quite automatically, and how widespread it is culturally. But it's a really interesting kind of question in and of itself. But also that the question of being is takes many different forms, and it's something that has been a philosophical topic of debate, of course, whether you can even think about the whole of being, whether that makes sense, whether, as Bertrand Russell kind of suggested, being or existence per se, or the whole of being, just makes no sense. You know, there's the being of phones and the being of numbers and the being of thoughts, each one having its own particular being, but that the sum of them is just the sum of those different things, rather than there being something which is being with a capital B, right? So I'm trying to point to the sense in which there's been a big debate about whether it even makes sense to talk about being, right? And significant parts of analytic philosophy say it's just a non-concept. You can only ever talk about the being of something in particular. And others for whom it's the ultimate primal question that all humans come back to as the foundation for thought, and indeed for some for religion as well. So given that this is a big thing, I'm going to try and look at how it plays out in these two contexts. So let's take a little step forward in just comparing, I think, how these two traditions try and approach this question. So let me move towards the magic of screen sharing. Come on, Zoom. Ooh, here we go. Oh no, come on, box. Here we go. Okay, great. Sorry. Share screen. Yeah. Share. Okay, great. And let's open this up. And ooh, great. Screen sharing, slideshow from the beginning. Okay, and let's also turn off the subtitles because they can be really comical. So In Search of Being, Heidegger and Vedanta. And this is not an unusual topic to look at. So India, of course, is famous for its radical approach to being. It's been a topic of great interest, partly because it has these nihilisms, these radical willingnesses in different traditions to eliminate the idea of particular things that we normally think of existing, including selves or even everyday objects, or even existence itself being questioned. And of course, the most famous example of that is in the Buddhist traditions of thought, where Anatman, of course, no self, but also the more radical version of Madhyamaka, which is willing to argue that the very notion of a thing existing, that existence itself is an impossible thing in the way we normally conceive of it. So ontological nihilisms, on a scale I don't think you even see significantly explored in the West, arguably. David Hume touches on it with his empiricism. But a kind of a systematic nihilism vis-a-vis everything, or in different forms, really has a kind of a place in India in a way that we see almost nowhere else in world culture. But India is also interesting because at the opposite extreme, we also have ontological monisms. So many very strongly developed 1,000 to 2,000-year-old traditions arguing that not only do things exist, but indeed everything exists preeminently as a manifestation of the optimum form of being, the self-existent being itself. So in a sense, as someone like Spinoza is looking for a kind of an argument from a self-existent fundamental substance that is the preeminent form of being, and that all other things have in fact to partake in that, and that therefore it's not that nothing exists, but rather that everything has a foot, at least, grounded in the ultimate, most integrity-full form of ontological being there could be. We find a lot of that in India as well. And of course, famously, we find the attribution of being per se of a kind of divinity. And that what that means exactly is complex in the Indian context, but you certainly get pantheisms. That word has a whole history behind it. But as it could be variously defined, we find pantheisms there. And maybe a topic of recent interest, even some panpsychisms, right? So there have been numerous discussions about notion of the possibility of rethinking ontology in terms of some kind of consciousness related medium. Galen Strawson has made this very popular, but he's not the only one. Leibniz is a little bit back in fashion. You'd be surprised to see that happen, I think. But so you've got a whole range of, even within analytic philosophy, a range of different approaches that would like to see new conceptions of being per se, and also new ways of even reconceiving what we mean when we talk about existence or being. Right? And India, for a long time, has been one of the places people go for those ideas. Ever since Schopenhauer made him trendy in Germany via the translation by Anquetil Duperron into Latin, India has been kind of this popular resource, as we know. And of course, he turns up in Hegel, and he turns up later in Nietzsche as well. And more recent scholarship has also been interested in Heidegger and Vedanta, Heidegger and Hinduism more generally, Heidegger and Asian thought, Heidegger and pantheism. Gavin Flood's book, The Truth Within there, Heidegger and, if you like, phenomenology, Husserlian style or Merleau-Pontian phenomenology. My wacky book at the bottom, not so much Heidegger, but Gadamer's philosophy and Vedantic philosophy as well. And a more recent article I did on Heidegger and kind of his phenomenology of religion and how that would relate to India. And I'm going to argue, I guess, that there are two key reasons why we keep seeing this shared fascination with Heidegger and India. One is going to be that the Indian tradition, like Heidegger, is interested in being per se, the one reality of all things, conceived in terms of a unified conception of being, unified characteristic that all being shares, or some sort of understanding of what it means for all of it to be conceived as one, or in terms of a single character. So being per se is a shared concern for both. I think I'd also argue that India, like Heidegger, that's true. That's something you could say that's sort of true for all of the scholastic history of philosophy, Islamic to some extent Jewish, and certainly classic sort of Christian scholastic thought. They're all interested in being, partly because they have a vested religious interest. But also something that's more distinctive to Heidegger. Heidegger wants to not just look at being, but to go beyond the ways it's been traditionally conceived, famously, of course, in getting beyond quote unquote metaphysics in the terms that Nietzsche gave to it. And also getting beyond substance. What he often means by metaphysics, I think, is just substance ontology, right? And the concern that that itself is problematic. And again, I think a lot of that can be traced fairly closely back to Nietzsche. If you read Twilight of the Idols and things like this, when Nietzsche talks about the mummification of philosophy, when he talks about philosophy's turn to deadness, non-temporal, unchanging, unhuman reality, as a kind of a bizarre post-Platonic, or for him post-Socratic, obsession of Western thought. And that the idea that we should actually get away from that, Heidegger's really picking up on that. So when Heidegger famously talks about the idea that philosophy is fundamentally Greek, or being is fundamentally Greek, he also, in a sense, is calling one to go beyond that tradition, towards traditions that can get away from this concept of being and the way that it's been conceived that we want to escape from. India kind of wants to do that too. I want to just try and show, as the main thrust of this talk, the ways in which India tries to get beyond a substantialist conception, a reified conception, a mummified, in Nietzschean terms, conception of being as a kind of a dead matter, into something more. So if we think of Heidegger's search for being, and just to pause for a moment, that there's so much one can say about Heidegger, so many different directions to take. Heidegger as phenomenologist, Heidegger as a being and time guy, Heidegger's Heidegger in ecology, so many different Heidegger directions. I'm just going to focus on this kind of thrust of his journey to try and define being in itself. In some ways, in Heidegger's search for being, he can be seen as just an heir of the classic scholastic tradition. And there's a nice, I always read Heidegger a little bit Gadamer-ishly, because I did my PhD on Gadamer. And in Gadamer's Philosophical Hermeneutics, which is a series of essays that are really interesting and 10 times more enjoyable to read than Truth and Method. In it, he talks about Heidegger as still, in a sense, a hungry Thomist. He's still like Aquinas, hungering to understand being, because for him, being will take us to God. And a lot's been written on Heidegger in terms of his sources, his theological sources, and the way in which there is a kind of a worship of God through the being that isn't just our human idol of being that's there. It's still very Levinas, it's still very, all these things that sort of fit into that critique. So he shares the hunger of Aquinas, Eckhart, and Jakob Böhme for being. And already, while Aquinas can be misleading, Meister Eckhart and Jakob Böhme both have this pantheistic dimension to them, right? They both have a conception of being as single, creative, dynamic. Well, Eckhart, whether it's creative and dynamic is complicated, but for Böhme it certainly is, and divine. And to delve into its depths, whether they're seen as mysterious and beyond conception, or whether they're seen as creative and dynamic, is to delve into the divine, and it's a desirable thing to do. Heidegger picks up a lot of that. And then, of course, he cross-references it with this Kierkegaardian urgency that we have to stay alive to our place in being, right? So we can't simply conceive being in our heads, of course, and then put it to the side. We have to make it something that we understand, A, as live, dynamic, and active, B, as something that we're part of, right? So we have to understand it from within, and C, that has dimensions we probably would never know. Right, it has to be able to get beyond our minds as well. So he's continuing those traditions, combining those two impulses. And yet at the same time, of course, as a phenomenologist, he's channeling the influence of Kant and the sense that we've lost touch with the real as a Ding an sich, as a thing in itself. The old model of the real object has disappeared behind the kind of Cartesian veil. And yet Heidegger's part of that move to get over the sadness of the loss of that being. He's taken on board Nietzsche's concerns with the mummification of the world via reification. He's been inspired by Husserl's new way of conceiving being from within in some sense, the idea that we can get beyond Kant if we just pay attention actually to being as it manifests in the structures we engage. Seeking, in a sense, he uses the term he doesn't use the term a meta-ontology, he uses that ontology which is the possibility of all ontologies. So being now conceived as a kind of structural foundation of what it is to even conceive of different ways of structuring the world that we experience. Not choosing one option, but rather looking at, as it were, the prerequisite meta-ontological structures. And also, Gadamer reminds people that he wants to get beyond the being as just a generic notion of stuff that is there, but rather to engage some kind of positive conception of being, which of course is really hard without reifying it. So Heidegger's always playing in this messy place of trying to find something that's true of being, but that doesn't just capture it within a box. And I'm really thinking also in terms of later Heidegger rather than earlier Heidegger. So I'm a late Heideggerian, I think. And here, I think particularly concerned with what he talks about as the abandonment of subjectivity, right? That after being in time and as he moves into his later thought, he's trying to conceive being not just as a describing the way we experience stuff, but in some sense, being in itself. And yet still from the perspective of phenomenologically describing, as it were, what we engage phenomenologically as the world. So he has this desire to twist around and describe being, but not abandon our direction of access to it, which is through experience. So this really sets up Heidegger as kind of a puzzle solver, or someone seeking to solve a puzzle, which has been set up for him by the whole of Western philosophy, and which is a lifetime journey with which he, of course, famously isn't really sure how he falls at the end. It's not clear that he feels he's found the complete solution. The famous essay, "Only a God Can Save Us," gives people the impression that Heidegger felt he wasn't happy with what he'd ended up with. There were still elements of the model that were yet to be desired, and indeed maybe that the model was always going to be an open one. Famously, of course, Heidegger turns towards Asian thought rather than he turns towards Asian thought as a solution to what he sees as being lacking in the Greek heritage. Although his Asian thought that he turns to is much more East Asian than Indian. Interesting why Heidegger doesn't turn to India when so many people were interested in it. Possibly worth remembering that a lot of the German tradition was influenced by Hegel's kind of negative view of Vedanta, the main monist being oriented, being per se oriented tradition. There's also a lot on Vaisheshika, but I'm going to focus on Vedanta. Heidegger's had a bit of a prejudice against it partly because Hegel, in his, I think, I can't remember, his History of Religions, talks about Vedanta and Indian philosophy of that kind as over-uniting being, not paying attention to the differentiations within being, as not having a sufficiently sophisticated conception of being in its actual spatio-temporal eidetic determination, and over-uniting things. So it was depicted in a way as overly simplistic, I think, both in the technical sense of seeking simplicity ontologically, but also in the cultural sense of kind of just being a simplistic tradition. So he kind of sees it as primitive. And I think a lot of other Germans picked up that idea. But what we kind of want to suggest is that actually there is more there than Heidegger saw. Again, as a bit of a Gadamerian, I think there's an argument that Heidegger didn't give much credit to the more subtle nuances of Greek thought, and he certainly missed it in India. But it wasn't his concern to do that with India, so that's fine. So if we think about India as a tradition that is concerned with being per se, and is concerned with going beyond substance ontologies, then one more thing I'll say, it's also coming out of an interest in ontological ground, so the source and basis of everything. And the last point of connection, it also adopts often a phenomenological approach to being. That is, it tends to be very aware of the idea that the perceiver and perception itself must be factored into any attempt to study reality, right? So you get a lot more traditions from 8th century BC, from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which talk about all reality as either emerging from mind or existing in the medium of perception, or as being affected by perception, or as being in some sense a matter not of being in or outside the mind, but of manifesting as phenomena, if you like. All right, the terminology here is complicated, but there's a very early strand of phenomenological approach to ontology, which we find early on. So, and just some of you will be, Indianists, and again, I'm telling you stuff you already know. But India has a huge set of terminology which is concerned with ontological concerns. It talks about materials of reality, the pradhana of all things. Pradhana is really interesting because it's such an abstract term, which really means something like a prime matter. And to even have that term turning up so early and being applied both in kind of cosmogonic myth and also in sort of theories of causation is really fascinating. You also see, of course, the term prakriti, which very generally is used across traditions to just mean a kind of basic material. Dravya, linked to the term meaning to flow, almost a substance or fluid that things are made out of. And the more technical term upadana karana, the literally material cause. Right? So we have these terms that really mean the material and are applied to all things. We also have separate terms for foundations turning up, and these are really important and constantly being used in scholastic discussions about what the basic ground of things are, the adhisthana, as in English, literally shta, to stand on, that on which things stand, avastha, similarly. But you also get the concepts of foundation that go beyond the usual ways of thinking of foundation as a thing. Right? And this is very much playing into modern ideas. What does it mean to think about grounding? If you just think of it as a thing on which another thing is put, you always beg the problem of regress. What grounds the ground? Right? So what kind of thing could be a fundamental ground? And some of the terms that are used often don't mean a thing. They kind of leave open the idea of what it is that grounds things. Ashraya is sometimes used almost as a field onto which things are superimposed, or a medium of something. Kshetra, literally a field, so that it can be something that just the form arises on the basis of this phenomenon that makes the form possible. It's not automatically saying it's a separate thing which needs itself to be grounded. And you get notions of adhara and adeya, putting something on something or being supported by something. So you have a wide range of kind of quite abstract terminology. Consciousness, of course, is given a whole multifaceted range of analysis in yogic and Samkhya traditions, chit, but also buddhi, ahankara, the ego, manas, which is mind. And all of these things are different, right? Interesting that the West doesn't have this range of nuanced distinctions for thinking about different kinds and levels of consciousness in quite the same way. And it also, of course, has plenty of transcendental arguments pretty much from the get-go, where texts will say the very fact that all that we perceive is in the medium of consciousness provides us with a transcendental argument that consciousness does exist, and in fact is invariably concomitant, it's coterminous with existence. We never observe things existing without our consciousness medium for them. So that very quickly transcendental arguments kind of are linked to the phenomenon of existence itself. So we've got a big bunch of technical sources that help us to think through the place of being in India. And I don't want to go too far over time, but I'm going to rush through some of this. A lot of early sources also set India up to think about materials. So I know we've got this here. Perhaps I can move that. But early texts from the Rig Veda, we're looking at something like 1000 BC here. Talk about the foundation and support of the universe. Oops, there we go. Trying to get this to move. There we go. The foundation and support of the universe, and how the universe comes into action. What is the forest, the wood from which heaven and earth are formed? Interesting to hear these because maybe the Old Testament asks these questions. We're looking at that kind of basic early philosophical cosmological reflection from a culture. Maybe, I think the pre-Socratics certainly asked these questions, but that's considerably later than this material. At a very early stage, India's asking, what is the material, the wood from which the whole universe is made? And a key text is Rig Veda 10.129, sometimes called the Nasadiya Sukta, and sometimes called the Hymn of Creation, because that text starts with an almost transubstantial way of thinking. Neither the non-existent nor the existent existed then, at the beginning of the universe. Nor was there world, nor sky, nor what is beyond. So rather than saying, as almost all the other ancient Near cultures said, there was a great chaos of stuff, or there were dark waters, very common Egyptian myth, Hebrew myth, start with some inchoate substance. There's a kind of an opening here, neither asat, non-existence, nor sat. Right? There are debates about exactly how to interpret that, but already it's saying it's not just that there's stuff or even the absence of stuff. What could be the thing that generates everything? What was the covering of that place belonging to what was their cosmic water, unfathomable depths? So even where is it? What kind of conditions make it possible for the beginning being to be? So if you do either sort of Big Bang physics or indeed the cosmological argument in philosophy of religion, you come across this problem. What kind of thing could it be that exists before the singularity and yet makes it possible? And in the Chandogya Upanishad, another key source, we have a text that explicitly says it can't have started with nothing. There has to have been a single source of some kind. So in the beginning sun, this world was simply what is existent, one only without a second. And from what is non-existent was born what is existent. So from what is existent was born what is now existent. And he sort of says, how can that be? How can what is existent be born from what is non-existent? So he refers to the arguments that there was nothing and then spontaneously there was the world. And he says, this is impossible. On the contrary, son, in the beginning, this world was simply what is existent, one only without a second. The whole text section says there has to be some self-existent material that is the basis of everything that we know. And then you get the cosmogony, and it thought to itself, let me become many. So a single being is there, all pretty much from the beginning. And this becomes woven into subsequent philosophy. So we see in the Upanishads development of the idea that all beings are made out of that fundamental being. As an old man, you totter along with a walking stick. The hymn says to being, as you are born, you turn your face in every direction. You're the dark blue bird, the green one with red eyes, the rain cloud, the seasons, and the oceans. It's kind of a beautiful poem celebrating, in a sense, omnipresent being. And indeed, the divine becomes defined in the Brahma Sutras as that from which is the origin, sustenance, and dissolution of all things. Right? Important that the divine here is defined not theistically primarily from the early sources, but defined just in terms of a kind of material causality, origin, sustaining support, and the dissolution. It returns to this, right? So it's not something generating separate beings, it's rather something which generates forms, which ultimately redissolve back into this underlying source. And I won't go through this, but there's also an argument in the Samkhya Karaka for why you in fact have to have a medium underneath all forms of change that is the single medium. So in short, what you get as the Vedantic tradition goes on is ontological arguments for a single sense of which there is being that unites all things. A lot of the time they're fighting the Buddhists who are arguing that there really isn't, that there aren't even individual separate things. There aren't even atoms. There are just phenomena which have no ontological nature whatsoever, right? Vedanta's fighting that, and they say not only do they not like that view particularly, but more importantly, they just think it's philosophically untenable. Why? Essentially, the main argument is because the world has shape. If we lived in just random fleeting phenomena, there would be no reason that we would see discrete books, phones, time, people, words, right? As a continuous and coherent formation making up the world. right? Moment by moment, case by case, instance by instance of existence, there would be nothing to link them and give them any kind of coherent form. The Vedantic thinker said there has to be some substrate, there has to be some form of a shared medium that enables there to be this coherence. So one argument is that there must be a self-existent foundation. This avoids regress. There has to be something that was the source of everything. Otherwise, you just get a regress backwards into infinite number of contingent beginnings. They also, as I said, observe that there's a kind of invariable concomitance between phenomena and whatever it is that we mean by being. It's almost a way of saying something exists, the phenomena, whatever it is that is invariably concomitant, always present in all that we experience, that is being. But the most important argument here is that they believe there must be some monistic, shared, unified substrate of all things, or medium or connecting framework, indicated by the fact that we can see instances interacting. And we can see, even if you don't agree with that, in the Humean style skepticism, there is certainly coherence, some sort of pattern structured coherence that just, it seems completely bizarre not to look for some explanation of how that would be, because complete random chaos would not yield that pattern. You can boil this down to the idea that we can always ask for a material cause of things, and whatever that is, you could come up with totally separate material causes for different kinds. So for instance, a mind-matter dualism. But if you see them interacting, or any form of coherent relation between them, then it seems to be the case you'd have to agree some framework or medium for that interaction, right? It doesn't have to be stuff, but some kind of shared framework that allows for interactions and coherences. So what material cause, what efficient cause, and what formal cause of the universe becomes really important. The Buddhists end up saying it's lots and lots of fleeting instances. And when the Hindus say, well, how do you get a coherent world of different forms moving through time? The Buddhists say, oh, that's pratitya samutpada. It's a kind of just the brute fact of a kind of non-causal causal pattern that gives shape to everything. And the Hindus say, that doesn't work. You've just said, effectively by calling it pratitya samutpada, you've said, we're not going to answer the question of what that is. We refuse to explain it. We're just going to say it's there. So if you say to the Buddhist, where does pratitya samutpada come from? Where does the coherent shape of the universe come from? The Buddhists, you could ask this question to David Hume, they'd go, I don't know, and I don't want to explain it. I don't think it has to be explained, right? So you can go there into whether they're just rejecting any form of metaphysical explanation or saying that there isn't a causation. Now, main point that I really want to make before I kind of open up a little is that discussion and reflection on this single medium, this unified substrate of all reality, leads the Vedantic thinkers through more than 1,000 years, 1.5, maybe 2,000 years, of looking for new ways of thinking about what that unified medium is. They start with a fairly simple idea of clay pots. So there's something that you get also in Aristotle, a kind of a malleable material that takes different forms. Aristotle talks about metal. In India, they talk about clay, but also metal, gold is used, a material that takes forms, almost like matter. But this is quickly seen to be inadequate, right? That just doesn't seem to work for thought, for number, for abstract form, for time, for events, all kinds of things that don't fit well into that model. It's aimed at physical things, but that's not all that reality consists of. In a way, that's the substance ontology that they want to get away from. So you get notions of milk and curd, something that literally transforms its nature into new kinds of things. This is sometimes linked to the idea that there are emergence philosophies in India. Janardhan Ganeri talks about this, that reality isn't just one stuff taking different shapes. It's a medium that can become matter, it can become energy, it can become mind, it can become abstract reality. What kind of thing can become, in a sense, or underpin all of this? So you get a milk curd model. You also get meanings words. So the idea of reality is something more kind of conceptual, something more almost eidetic, hermeneutic, linguistic, You get an agent tool model. So reality is a kind of an agency expressing itself through different tools or media of agency, right? That's associated with Ramanuja. I'll come back to some of these. So almost reality as events, a fire flames analogy, reality as a single medium, which is itself kind of energies or activities of manifesting, right? And that image is used for almost like a process ontology. You even get this very abstract, what I've argued is almost like a computational ontology. It's almost a logical form of ontology, just in terms of relations of eidos structure and form. Space and divisions. The image of an upadi is just if you take any space or field and you divide it up in different ways, you get an ontology, which really just means how you define object and how you define relation. This is used in computational science. And even field and projection. So just a field onto which different images or different sort of selective ways of shaping particulars can be projected. In a sense, as this goes on, and to some extent, these unfold temporally. So clay pots analogy you find in already in about 600 BC, milk curd analogy 300 BC-ish, Bhattacharya's meaning words analogy, I don't know, 0 perhaps. The agent tool analogy, that's Ramanuja, that's about 1100, 1200. Fire flames analogy becomes popular in the early modern period, as do the space and divisions analogies. The field projections one is already there from quite an early stage. Now, I'm not going to go into these arguments because there isn't time, but there are lots of arguments for how we would argue for a single being. Bhaskara, I use there, is a Beda Vedantin who really wants to argue for the notion of a single reality with these powers to become different things. He uses something called Satkaryavada. And you also get those more in the Advaita tradition who think of being in terms of just the division, the vyakrita, literally the dividing or sort of separating, differentiating of a field of reality. So much more almost kind of a hermeneutic or concept or eidetic phenomenology. And what you get at the end of this process is a tradition that includes dialectical concepts of being. So have I missed one? No. Yeah, dialectical concepts of being, not only kind of substance, not only energies or power potencies emerging. There's kind of a new Aristotelian philosophy associated with people like Anna Marmaduro, where the idea of looking at substances as a power to emerge and develop rather than a stuff. So you get those ontologies. You also get dialectical ones. This is one that I worked on in the early modern Vedanta of the Goswamis, which talks about realities being almost like a play with complex parts, which together generate a story which is really made out of relations between many different aspects. If you ask, what is the nature of a complex work of art? What is the nature of Romeo and Juliet as a whole work? It's intrinsically complex, right? It is constituted by that manifold character. And you get those who talk about this, and indeed the development of the notion of being as something called rasa, a kind of affective flavor of all phenomenal existence. So if being has this dialectical texture to it, it also generates at the perceptual level, phenomenologically, a kind of an experiential affective mood or flavor or character, a qualia of being itself as phenomenologically experienced. You get subjectivity ontologies, subjective idealist notions. So this is associated with the Kashmiri Shaiva school of thought. And a lot's been written on them as a kind of very sophisticated subjective idealism, where reality, being is known and proven directly through transcendental reflection. And there's a single ocean of consciousness. So they embrace the idea that the nature of being is consciousness. So what are we within it? Thinking back to Heidegger's phenomenology, we're kind of contractions, ripples or splashes within that consciousness, which isn't subjectively structured as a particular person. It's subjectively structured according to the many different identities that it contains and the very principle of self-differentiation. So I've put on this model, being isn't subjectively structured as an intentionality of the self and the other, free action as human subjectivities are, free action that's constrained, or our movement through finite time, not subjectively structured like Dasein for us, but rather trying to think about what an idealistic being would be in and of itself. It would have an intentionality of creative internal self-differentiation, radically free action, not constrained by anything, to generate any circumstance, and time not as the condition of being, and finitude not as a condition of being, but as key creative powers that can be deployed to generate sort of subsidiary elements. And whether they think of Shiva as being conscious or not is a complicated issue, but one doesn't necessarily have to take it that way. There's a linguistic version of this in Bhartrhari, and others as well. And I won't go into it, but of course for these schools, it is true that being isn't just being, though I think you can take their arguments for the being as a single thing and the nature of being. I think they stand on their own merits as being a philosophical interest, but they do see it as divine, and partly because the book I'm writing currently, there was a concept of just matter, of just material, secular, non-divine being as the nature of everything that existed in certain early branches of the Samkhya school. But Vedanta argued against this, and part of the reason they argued that being is itself in some sense divine was just on the basis of its profound generative creative quality. They say for something to be self-existent and also infinitely generative, for them was the definition of it being divine. Right? So it's not about the classic, omnibenevolence, being wise, knowing, powerful, and personable. Here, the definition of being is much more about these two extraordinary ontological qualities that only the one fundamental substrate of being has. So I'll leave it there, but just in thinking in terms of whether this is answering some of Heidegger's concerns. Heidegger didn't really engage himself with Hinduism. He liked Taoism and Zen Buddhism because he saw them as rejecting reifying approaches to being. He liked the sort of process element and the dialectical element in Taoism. He liked Zen Buddhism's resistance to even talking being wise and reifying wise. But if we think about Hinduism as a response to the same questions that concern Heidegger, we can ask a few questions. If Heidegger is trying to get us away from all forms of ontology, and substance ontology, reifying ontology, metaphysically objectivized ontology, is even these sort of non-substantialist forms of Hinduism, are they too positivistic and reifying for Heidegger, right? Do they manage to escape Heidegger's post-Nietzschean concerns with metaphysics, right? Or are they producing a form of being which is more amenable, as it were? I have my own angle on this, which is again quite Gadamer shaped. And indeed, just in terms of what they're all trying to do, can we frame the material and the mood of being? If we see being in terms of a single whole and something linked to our own experience, what does it mean to try and capture that? What kind of answer would be adequate? What does it mean not only to try and capture something about being per se, but also to live being, remembering Heidegger's concern to remember that we are within it. We never get to see it as something other than us. So what does it mean to live these kinds of being and to frame our ontologies in terms of being there within it? Those are the things I'm still trying to work out. And if anyone has any solutions, please tell me, and I'll steal your ideas and publish them or something. Oh no, or we can do a wonderful project together. It's a much more positive option. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unscreen share. There you go. Can we go? No, I don't want to share. I want to unshare. What? Oh, stop share. There we go. Yay, we're back. And I'm going to stop talking finally and hand over to you guys.
Thank you for that, Jessica. All right, guys, if you have any questions, now would be the time to ask them. Please raise your hand if you do, and if you do not want your voice recorded, put them in the chat and I will read them out. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, so thank you for that. It was really, really interesting. And I think we could agree, definitely a weighty topic that I'm definitely going to be spending a bit of time getting my head around. But the question that I have, and apologies if it's a little bit off on a tangent. So you're talking about the idea that there's this connecting framework, which kind of gives a coherence to this array of phenomena and constitutive of a single reality. Is this not a very neuronormative kind of single reality that we're talking about? So if it's the case, is it not the case that being is this subjective thing, which isn't the same for everyone? So what comes to my mind is perhaps someone with schizophrenia wouldn't quite have the same experience of this single reality. So is it not we're posing something that isn't accessible to everyone?
Got you, yeah. It's an interesting question. So in some ways that raises the question of what it means to do ontology with phenomenology, right? Are you trying to literally, if you're just trying to say this is what experience looks like for everybody, done, then you really have to go out and see what experience looks like for everybody. And you'd have to encompass the widest range of variation. So let's say, I mean, interesting that a lot of the French phenomenologists said that all subjectivity is essentially intentionally structured, right? It's a very recur way of looking at things. So that there's always a sense of self, there's always a sense of otherness of some form, there's always a transformation through time. That was a fundamental, the Kantian categories are there. I was talking to some friends who love to do DDT, but sort of various drugs that really take out your intentional structure, right? If that's really the case that happens, I haven't tried it myself, then that is an actually interesting challenge, right? What are the range of variations of consciousness itself? But it's maybe worth remembering then, having said that, that the whole project of phenomenology initially was just to point to the most universal structures, right? So that in that case, in theory, you only point to the bits that just are always there. And that's why they talk about, what is content? What is it for consciousness to have any content? What is it for consciousness to undergo transformation through time, for instance? And what does it mean that it always has to deal with finite, particularistic character? Right? Big debates about that. So in a sense, that's what phenomenology is always trying to do. And it might be worth remembering, that for Heidegger, it's not just the sum of the experiences we have. It's something about the very nature of what being is, of how it's structured. That's even more true for Gadamer, who has this idea that you really can find the most basic weave. You go, it's like people looking for theory of everything. Is it atoms? Is it particles? Is it strings? What does it mean to get to the most basic universal features of the fabric itself? And once you do that, in theory, hopefully you've escaped all those particular determinations of experience. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. It's just kind of what came to my mind, because I always kind of criticize or shy away from these very grand narratives that look for all existence, because it always makes me a little bit queasy and feels like you're going to end up excluding someone. And of course, if we're looking for universal, that's what we want to do. But that made sense. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Jessica, for your answer. Ishmael.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It was like Michael, a lot to unpack. But sort of, I haven't sort of read so much Heidegger, but what I found when I have is that his idea of sort of uncovering this sort of fundamental being and sort of this authentic sort of self, or sort of as Dasein, he never really elucidates the specifics of, okay, what happens then? So you've done this, now what? And I'm wondering sort of if in these kind of Vedanta traditions you're referring to, if actually any kind of specifics or even kind of practical applications of this kind of engagement with fundamental being are kind of talked about or engaged with.
That's a really interesting question. So good. And in some ways that's a nice observation about Heidegger, that whether he's completely clear about what he even means by it is kind of an interesting question. He's really grasping and remembering that for him, being is also kind of linked to God, and to even try to fully know it is controversial. If you go back and read his Phenomenology of Religion, the early essay he writes, he's not even sure he wants to get to it or thinks he can get to it. So it's a complicated thing for him. But you're right that there's something about that that means he thinks you're never really going to get it, and he doesn't really address that issue very clearly. And he doesn't have a kind of a moksha. He doesn't really have a, then once you do it, everything will be great. And that's partly because he remains super Catholic and actually super Lutheran as well, right? Lots of humility, lots of we can't know until we've been transformed. So yeah, that's a nice pointing to an area in which India can at least offer some interesting ideas. And I think there's a range of different approaches. One of the key things, I guess, is between the Advaita group and other groups who are kind of more realist. You've got the Advaita Vedantins would say that being in itself, you can get to the original stuff, is fundamentally non-particular. It has no defining characteristics or internal differentiations or empirically accessible character as experience. It's pure consciousness. And that was a very exciting notion. You know, purity is always an exciting rhetoric in a way. And I don't want to diss Advaita Vedanta. I got into Hinduism at first, quite fascinating with it. But all the other Hindu schools say, that's great, but what is it going to be like to be there? And does it make sense? Can you have being with no characteristics? Can you have consciousness with zero content? Even self-awareness is kind of, in a sense, gone. And does it make sense to explain that as the source of the world with all its complex, rich particularity? So that there are those who sought that, but it's interesting that for them to access that level of being, people used to make fun of those concepts of liberation or fulfillment as being like a stone. They'd be like, great, I can't wait till I get to authentic pure being. When I have no content to my consciousness, time is gone and all relational experience is gone, I'll be like a stone, just sitting there, doing nothing, experiencing nothing. Wow, sounds fun. And you can imagine, you know, 3rd century Indians kind of laughing at having made fun of their mate. So I think it's interesting. There's a whole range of other conceptions of what that would mean to become part of that play of consciousness. And without going, I could go into a whole new lecture on it, but the Kashmiri Shaivas are really interesting, seeing it as what it means to expand the nature of consciousness to enjoying and, in a sense, controlling and exploring the capacities of consciousness to be. And a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment looks at cases where this is kind of opened up as something for humans to explore and, in a sense, play with. Texts that say, let's explore consciousness with our minds. Let's see what it means to understand in the larger sense. How does it expand your own personality when you're starting to see being, not just as your own little set of concerns? So that is a really long rambling answer, but there's so many different ways that they go into it that I think potentially are kind of empowering, interesting, and about the enjoyment of consciousness and being itself.
Oh, that was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. All right, we have 2 hands up now. I'm conscious that we are now over the time, but if you're all willing to stay, then I think we can go ahead and accept those 2 questions and possibly a third one from myself. So then Tamer and then Andrews, so long as that's okay with everyone.
I'll give shorter answers. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, so I had 2 questions, but maybe the second one, it could be over email. I think it's a more sort of personal question about the center, the Center of Hindu Studies. But yeah, so the first question that's actually relevant here is, so for my ISP for my 3rd year dissertation, I'm sort of trying to, so I'm looking at the field of mysticism studies basically, and sort of trying to go beyond the like cul-de-sac, the entire field as just car crashed into a paternalism, constructivism 24/7, you know, and if you're familiar, and yeah, and so you mentioned there that panpsychism is sort of gaining currency, and these other modalities where you know the sort of Cartesian Kantian academic orthodoxy is sort of slowly being, you know, maybe there's something beyond that. Maybe there's actually something else. And but still, I would say the orthodoxy is still this sort of constructivism, and part of that is this idea basically that, I mean, when I first encountered it, I was like, how is this the orthodoxy? But I mean, I guess it makes sense from a sort of, I don't know. Anyway, so that view essentially for everyone else is just basically that you can't actually experience anything outside of your cultural set. So your cultural set of ideas, beliefs, maybe some imagistic archetype stuff, you can't experience anything out of that matrix download that you got when you were growing up or in your life experience.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah, and so just to wrap up then, I was just thinking, yeah, what would you think then about the fact that in the Indian tradition and in these other possibilities, so the idea of the mystic thing and the Indian thing is that actually you experience the inside of reality directly, experientially, and that this sort of cultural set thing it's like the exact, it's completely opposite, completely different to that sort of view.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just
no, that's good. I kind of see where you're going with the question. That's helpful. Yeah, that's a good question. I guess two quick answers. One, there are thinkers in the Indian tradition who recognize kind of perspectivalism onto being. We just had a really good student who's now a master's student here who did an undergrad dissertation on Bhartrhari, who's this grammatical philosopher of language. And Bhartrhari says being is one. There is, Brahman is the word for the one divine reality. And he says it's a Shabda Brahman. It's a word, or semantically, if you liked, sort of kind of being. But that because it's semantic, because being is semantic, it has this kind of form, it's always perspectival. It's always from one direction or another, right? There's no version of being which is not, in a sense, from someone's perspective. But you are seeing it. So maybe that does mean that you'll never get the whole of it directly, empirically observed, right? I can't see the names on the screen, Tamara, Sohan, Michael, Nayantara, Sean, Andrew, Hillary. I can't get all of your perspectives onto being as well as mine. It would be cool if I did, but that's not going to happen. So there's a recognition of that. But the other side of it is that what I can get is a knowledge that it is perspectival, and a knowledge across the range of forms of being of what is necessarily constitutive in each case of the kind of experience you're having. Right, so it's a bit like saying, I can get lots of different mathematicses and lots of different equations, and if you all write down an equation now, I won't know what they are, but I'll know they're all made out of numbers. I know that they all have certain mathematical principles shaping those equations. That's the kind of knowledge I can have, in a sense, analytical, necessary prerequisite conditions and fabric, even if I don't know individually what perspectives you're all having onto being. So it's kind of an answer to that question. And just, yeah, I think a lot of the Indian traditions take that approach.
Brilliant, thank you. Andrew, you have the time to ask your question, please do.
It's fine, I'll yield to you, Sohan. It's absolutely fine. Thank you, Dr. Frazier there.
All right. My question, it's not fully formed, but I was interested in the description of the ontological method of meaning and word that you highlighted. And specifically, it made me think of a sentence that has been running around in my head since my second year module on ancient and medieval Indian philosophies, which comes from the Brandar Anyaka Upanishad 1.24, which is on the story of death. And it's the sentence where Death says, while I was engaged in liturgical recitation, water sprang from me. And I was wondering if there's any connection there and anything you could possibly say from that.
Ooh, I feel like that's a kind of a mystic puzzle of a question. I like that. So any connection, do you mean between the word and being in that kind of image? Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, it's an interesting text. The Brihadaranyaka, I've worked on the Chandogya Upanishad and the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. I'm interested in the early ones, and oh good. And the Brihadaranyaka is, in a sense, the more consciousness-oriented, phenomenologically oriented, meaning-oriented E1, I think. Chandogya is more about kind of the matter and stuff of being. And in that text, it's kind of fascinating that I think in the story, being is doing this, or death is doing, there's some primeval being is doing this activity. And from the activity comes being, right? And this reflects a pattern you see in other texts as well. There's often it's by speaking that existence happens, by desire, by love, one by loneliness, in at least one text through masturbation. So there's all kinds of activities that can yield the creation of the universe. And whether it's death or some primeval being who does it, it's a similar pattern. Here, I think the water then becomes the other elements and all the creatures of the universe develop. But I think that's right, that is a text where, linked to the early Vedic sort of ways of thinking, that language is the nature, in a sense, of fundamental reality. So the idea that the ancient Vedas are shruti, they're heard rather than seen. And the seers hear them because they are in the form of Sanskrit, that Sanskrit as a language reflects, in a sense, the structure of reality. An idea that the Nyaya Vaisheshika school uses to sort of use language as a guide to being. This is a long-standing, deeply rooted idea. So in that sense, it's very natural for India to think in terms of language as the way forward. And indeed, interesting that there's a hymn to Vach, the goddess speech, also has this function as a kind of generative source of reality as well. Yeah, so in a sense, I think I'm just saying, yes, I think that is one of the early roots linked to a Vedic way of conceiving reality in terms of language, that because it's in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is a key source for some of the most important kind of leitmotif Mahavakya sort of terms that people use to develop the phenomenological approach to being, it's definitely a turning point towards the kind of ideas that we're talking about here. And that, yeah, exactly the kind of ideas that have this connection to Heidegger's own way of thinking about language as the house of being, as it were.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we may have time, if we have extended this by 15 minutes, we may have time for a final question if there is any. If not, this is the right place to end, I guess. Just, yeah, little housekeeping notes. Oh, Andrew, oh, sorry.
I will, if I do have 2 seconds, and maybe it's more food for thought to follow up. Thank you so much. Following on from what you've just said to Sohan, I'm just quite curious about the problem in Heidegger about the fact that we can't look at being objectively, and so we kind of have to, at least in Being in Time, go through the existential analytic. So we can't look at being objectively, so we have to examine ourselves. And I know that you said you're more of a later Heideggerian, and that, in my view, I could be wrong, that always kind of turns to language. In the later Heidegger, we can't look at being objectively, so we can then think about. And I'm just curious if that tension is reflected at all in the Indian tradition that you're talking about. And you kind of hinted at that at the end, and then you didn't get a chance to develop it. So it's more just kind of a food for thought / question, if you had anything else to quickly say about that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's another good question. So all these are really good questions that point to kind of interesting issues and implications. Off the top of my head, so as not to keep you too long, it's true that there aren't that many traditions that directly say, in the way that Heidegger does, we can't just put it into a concept in our heads. As soon as we do that, we've distorted being. I think they might be often aware of that concern, but mostly they're happy to just go ahead and do metaphysics. You do get that idea, however, channeled into all the traditions that are skeptical about, or all the traditions that insist that we're always seeing from a certain perspective, right? I think that's their way of saying that. So Advaita Vedanta, when it talks about the idea that you're always bringing a certain background to the way that you conceive of things, you can't conceive of being in itself, does that. There's another form of Advaita that says, you're always seeing, in terms of an upadhi, you always only see one. Upadhi is a kind of a selective portion of being. They say it's like a diamond. you're only ever going to see a certain set of the colors the diamond shows at one time. You can't just ever see the diamond in itself. It's always refracting. There are texts in the tradition I worked on that say you're always going to see God in a different way precisely because of that. The Jain philosophers who say truth itself is a Nayavada, it's a perspective doctrine, you know, it's perspective shaped. They're always kind of acknowledging that. I think maybe the difference is, and this is where I'm going to come back one more time, my plug for the most boring German philosopher in history, but I think sometimes the right one, Gadamer. Gadamer goes back to Plato and says, like with the maths example, I can't tell you, I can't just show you every possible equation. There isn't even such a thing as every possible equation, right? It's the nature of the infinite nature of maths. But I can show you what it means for something to be a number, certain kinds of rules and conditions that shape that, the prerequisite conditions that even make mathematics possible. I can do a fabric analysis, but rather than trying to objectify it into a single object or to exhaustively describe it. And Gadamer would say it's that kind of analysis that Heidegger misses that Plato does that's so cool, right? He's over obsessed with Plato's forms and not sufficiently obsessed with the late Plato of the Parmenides, who thinks in very different kind of dialectical terms. So yeah, just that, it's a really good point. India doesn't say it explicitly, but I think the insight is woven through the way it deals with a lot of these issues.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, just housekeeping for the end. Wait, I'll stop recording and I will send out the recording in an email. It will also be available on all of DPS's socials. For any of you guys who want to go back and maybe re-listen to some bits, I think that will definitely be the case for me because this is complicated stuff. And yeah, thank you again, Dr. Frazier, and hoping that everyone found it interesting. If you guys want to continue to get involved in DPS events, I would really recommend signing up for our weekly emails, but also following us on our socials on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We post a lot of information there, and also we are in the process of getting a website. So if you want more information about all of that, please do keep in touch. We hope to hold a lot more events like this in the near future. All right. Thank you, everyone.